Hello, officially, and welcome to the MIT Press Live, a virtual event series brought to you by the MIT Press. My name is Philip Lachlan, and I'm a Senior Acquisitions Editor here at the Press. Today, I'll be speaking with longtime press author, Lee McIntyre. Lee is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He is also the author of 5 MIT Press books, including 3 that I've had the honor to publish in recent years. Post-Truth in 2018, Scientific Attitude in 2019, and just this past month, How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. In his new book, Lee argues that anyone can fight back against science deniers and argues why it's important to do so. Drawing on academic research and personal experience, including a visit to the Flat Earth Convention of 2018, Lee outlines the common themes of science denialism that appear in disinformation campaigns, a playbook used by tobacco companies in the 1950s, as well as today's anti-vaxxers. Lee, welcome to MIT Press Live.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here. I know you're a busy guy. You've had a lot of trips recently, a lot of talks you've had to give. So we appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to be here. So, I was thinking what, you and I had quite a run in recent years, publishing 3 very successful and hopefully influential books, the ones I just mentioned at the top of the hour. So I'd kind of like to start our conversation there. On the surface, Post-Truth, the Scientific Attitude, and Science Denialism, they all seem like separate topics that require separate books. And yet they also seem to be related to each other in some way. And I figure since you've thought of and written about these topics quite a bit in recent years, I'd like to know how you view the relationship between post-truth, science denialism, and the scientific attitude.
Okay, yeah. Well, as you know, in post-truth, I made the argument that there are a couple of different roots of post-truth, which I defined as the political subordination of reality. But maybe the biggest root was 60 years of unchecked science denial. What really started with the tobacco companies, as you said, in the 1950s, where they created a campaign of doubt out of nothing. And so they really learned how to use public relations to increase doubt and distrust. And so science denial, I think, gave the impetus to politicians and others to say, if they can do that about climate, if they can do that about tobacco, we can do that about anything. And so that's, I think, where post-truth came from. It's more from science denial to reality denial, about anything you want. And I think the second connection to bring the scientific attitude into it is that, the way that I define the scientific attitude in that book is that what's really distinctive about science is the idea, it's 2 things. One is the idea that scientists care about evidence. And the second is that they're willing to change their mind based on new evidence. And, if you think about it, that really, I think, captures the nugget of what scientists do, right? They're flexible enough to change their mind. And that's something that science deniers don't often do. They don't say in advance what evidence would change their mind. And even when presented with evidence that to a reasonable person would change their mind, they often don't. And so I think that's more or less the line through those 3 books. It's funny, as I finish writing one, I start to think about, well, what's next? What have I left out? What's the other bigger part of the story? And I get to them. But I'm grateful for the question because I think they are all 3 related.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you feel like science denialism really had its roots in sort of, I guess, corporate America and the idea of sort of muddying the evidence of whether it was climate denial or climate change or the link between smoking and cancer. Of course, I think a lot of viewers might think, oh, and then science denial leading to sort of post-truth. And I've always thought, oh, well, sort of postmodernism is sort of originates from the academy. And so it's sort of like this, is it an unholy alliance between the academy and the commercial interests? Or do you think that the academy took its clue from commercial interests? Or do you think that they were, sort of evolved on parallel lines? Or I know you've received
Yeah.
mail from both camps, so I don't
Yeah.
know
Yeah,
if you feel
pushback.
that they're working in concert at all, or if they're just largely parallel groups.
I've got to think it's parallel. I don't think that there's going to be much crossover there. The argument that I made in Post-Truth is that there are really five roots, the main one being the science denial, which can happen for economic reasons, but also for political or ideological reasons. But then there's the decline of traditional media, the rise of social media, and cognitive bias, of course, which has existed throughout our evolutionary history, and then postmodernism. So there were several different roots. I think of science denial as the tap root. I think of that as the main root of post-truth, because it really provided the blueprint for folks in Washington and elsewhere to be able to say, you can deny reality. Look how they did it. And the interesting thing is that you don't need to provide evidence. You don't need to convince somebody that you're right. All you need to do is raise enough doubt and create confusion, and then you win.
Yeah. It's amazing to watch it unfold before us.
It is.
Over all these media, different types of media.
Yeah.
So let's focus a little bit more on your latest book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, which, as I mentioned before, was just published last month by the MIT Press. In it, you offer tools and techniques for communicating the truth and values of science, emphasizing that the most important way to reach science deniers is to talk to them carefully, calmly, and respectfully, to put ourselves out there and meet them face to face. How did we get to this place where truth and the values of science are questioned on a daily basis?
It's hard to know. I mean, I wish I could answer that question, because I wish I knew. It seems to me that things are worse now because we're more polarized. We're getting our information from silos. We're getting our information from different places, depending on what our politics are, what our beliefs are. And that seems to me to have made it worse. The internet is, of course, part of that. But part of it's also just this idea that we're not talking to each other. I mean, if you think about our evolutionary history for a minute, where do people get reliable information? It probably was selected for through evolution that you get reliable information through the people in your community, through your family, the people that you're closest to. And in fact, that might even explain a little bit why, we're not just selecting only for truth, but for a certain social factor to belief. But what happens then when you start to prune down that network, and people who disagree with you are no longer in your community, they're no longer your family, friends, you cut people off. All of a sudden you're in an echo chamber. All of a sudden you're not getting outside information. And that's a very bad thing. And it can lead to, rejection of truth, somebody who just doesn't see something coming. And also, I think there's a real human cost, which is that, all of the strife that you've seen in American politics and American life and around the world these days, as we have disagreements, not just about values, but about facts. I mean, that's the part that still flummoxes me after all these years thinking about it. We disagree about facts.
Right. Whether or not to wear masks, the simplest things can get politicized.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
Yeah. So you also write in the book that science denial is not a mistake. It's the predictable result of disinformation campaigns that have been intentionally created to serve someone's political or economic agenda. So in that sense, it's different from mere misinformation. And you use both terms in the book, misinformation and disinformation, quite a bit. Why do you think that that's an important distinction to make between misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, I think it's important because, and I mean, you see this all the time in major media. They talk about the things that people believe about ivermectin, or if you wear a mask, you're going to get CO2 poisoning or something like that. They treat it as if it were misinformation. Misinformation, that would mean it was an accident. And I don't think that science denial is a mistake. I think it's a lie. It's not based on misinformation. It's based on disinformation, which is intentionally created by someone for their own selfish interest. Sometimes that can be economic, as we've
Mhm.
discussed with climate change or with tobacco, but sometimes it can be ideological or political. And so what that means is that we've really got the wrong mindset for how to fight vaccine denial, for instance.
Mhm.
Because if you watch the way that we're pushing back, we're using something that people in the trade call the information deficit model, as if you just give people the facts and then they'll change their mind. But that's not what science denial is about. It's really
Mhm.
more about identity. And
Mhm.
so how can you push back in the right way? We're not only not talking to one another, we're not talking to one another in the right way. And when we do talk, we're insulting and angry and impatient. And
Mhm.
that's just not the way to convince somebody that they're wrong.
Yeah, it's very hard to shame somebody into believing the right thing.
That's right.
It's very tempting to do it in an online medium, but it's probably not the best way to go about doing it. I always like to joke that nobody's ever changed their mind about a serious issue based on a tweet. So it's like you
That's
have to
right.
be very, you have to, in some ways, the way that we're all communicating with each other now on social media is kind of like the least effective way to engage in a real conversation and
It's
to
true.
truly change somebody's mind. So, uh,
It's
cool.
it's true. Face to face is so nice because there's just something about the humanity of seeing someone, not doing it anonymously online, and where we can take
Right.
the temperature down and actually have a conversation. And I'm talking here about even when we disagree vehemently about facts,
Mhm.
if we treat one another with respect, the magic that happens is we earn the other person's trust. And as
Mhm.
I've also said, science denial isn't about an information deficit, it's a trust deficit, because you
Mhm.
can overcome doubt through evidence, but you can't overcome distrust through evidence, because if you don't trust the person giving you the facts, what do? How do you overcome distrust? Through engagement, through
Mhm.
patience, through listening.
Yeah. So it's almost as if you trust somebody, you can still disagree with them, but you won't the sort of the nasty. There won't be the nastiness that is often attaches itself to a
That's
lot of
right.
online kind of dialogue.
Yeah.
So it sort of allows for reasonable disagreement, I suppose, but still maintains the basis of the relationship, which is
Yeah.
so important with the major holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas.
You're right. You're right. We all face that. What are you going to do
Yeah,
about your uncle across the Thanksgiving table who's
exactly.
an anti-vaxxer? What do you say to him? That's right.
Right, right. So I'm curious, this idea about trust and face-to-face communication, was that in any way the reason why that you wanted to go to the Flat Earth Convention a few years ago? That was that you wanted to engage face to face with people who sort of saw the world in a fundamentally different way than you did, and see that if you could work some of that trust magic on them and get them to sort of come around to your point of view, or what? It's just unusual that a
Yeah,
philosopher
then I would
scientist
do
would
it.
go to a Flat Earth Convention. So I'm curious to know what were your motives for going there in the first place.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I remember that I thought, well, if I go there in person, I'll build trust. I mean, that might have occurred to me, but I wanted to go because it was there, and I'd been studying science denial for 15 years from my desk, and I kept getting questions on the road as I was doing publicity for the other books, and people would say, what should we be doing? And I would say, well,
Mhm.
talk to people who disagree with you. But
Mhm.
then I started to think, why am I not out there doing that? I mean, I was going to Georgia and Nebraska, but I was in the blue bubbles, so where I was talking to people. And so I
Mhm.
wanted to see what it would be like to talk to folks who, in my opinion, were the hardest of hardcore science deniers. I mean, even other science deniers often make fun of folks in flat Earth. I thought, could I have a civil conversation? What would I learn? And then,
Right.
but there was one other motivation here, which was that there's some academic research which show, I didn't do this research, it's from some cognitive scientists, which shows that um, all science denial is the same. It's all the same type of reasoning. And I thought, I can't go to flat Earth and talk about Aristarchus and Newton and Galileo. That's not going to work. They know that stuff and they
Mhm.
reject it because they don't trust it. So,
Mhm.
but what can I do? I can go there and talk to them about their reasoning strategy. I'm a philosopher. I know how to do that. And so before it was, vindicated in the literature, I already thought, well, as a philosopher of science, I can go out there and talk to people about logic, about reasoning, about warrant, about evidence. And so that's what I did at the Flat Earth Convention. And it was uncomfortable to the point of even being searing, kind of in some way. But it was really an important 2 days of my life, because what I learned is that you can have civil conversations even across that divide. And I want to be careful here. I was showing them respect, not because I thought they were right, or even that they should be on the school committee, arguing that they should teach this in school. No, I won't want them to have that kind of a platform. But respect as a person, to hear them out, to listen, because then it does build up trust. And so that's one of the lessons that I learned as a result of going, that you can get somebody to listen to you if you build trust by listening to them first.
I'm curious, the people that you did speak to at the convention, did they identify themselves as science deniers, or do they just, or does that not really, is that a label?
Nobody
that they
does.
reject?
No, nobody ever does. Nobody ever identifies as a science denier. They thought of themselves as more scientific than the scientists.
Okay.
They would say they're skeptics. And I'd say, well, me too, because I'm now I'm a different kind of skeptic. I'm a Humean skeptic. And, we didn't get into all that, but, I didn't want to lie to them. The first day I kept my mouth shut, I am a skeptic, an empiricist skeptic, but, they saw themselves as legitimately questioning these truths of science. Now, what I know to be the case, as a result of those conversations, is that they radically misunderstand what skepticism is and believe that science owes them proof or certainty before they're justified in believing what they have to say. At the same time, they will gullibly believe something that they want to believe without much evidence at all. And so that kind of a double standard, I talked to them about that. I did have an opportunity on the second day to begin talking about that. But even as you say, there was even some opportunity for common ground just about skepticism. I wasn't lying. I am a skeptic, just not about
just a different type of skeptic.
That's right. That's right.
Well, it's interesting that you said that they view themselves as sort of possessing the right kind of skepticism, like they're skeptical of the science, and in that way they're sort of like super scientists because they're even skeptical of what the scientists can do. But I mean, did you ask them about, credentials or educational background?
They didn't have them, and proudly so. One of the speakers said, I don't have any degree, but I have a white lab coat, and that's all the authority that I need. No, he said that proudly. Okay.
Yeah. And what was the reaction?
Applause.
Oh, wow.
Because imagine if you distrusted scientists. Imagine if you thought that scientists were part of a worldwide conspiracy that was lying to you, that knew the truth about the shape of the earth, but was lying to you. Now, the part of it that I found mystifying is that they were not anti-science. They were just anti-science when it came to the shape of the earth and whether we'd gone to the moon and such. I mean, they flew there on planes. Sure, even while thinking that all the pilots,
cell phones, I assume,
and they had cell phones, right? While even thinking that the pilots were in on the conspiracy, and not really grappling with the idea that their cell phones were engaging in satellite traffic, to get their opinions about the shape of the earth out there. So the irony there was lost in them. So they were not anti-science. I think of science deniers as cafeteria skeptics. They'll go through the line and say, I like this, I don't like that, I don't like that. And then we'll apply a double standard when it's something that they don't want to believe.
Yeah. Did you get a sense that a lot of the people that there was sort of an evangelical component or with a religious component to the population of people who were at the convention? Did you feel that, or did you feel that religious affiliation had no real role in their form of science denial?
Demographically, just looking at the crowd and what they said, about 70% of them were evangelical Christians.
Mm.
Now, a lot of them had been kicked out of their church and, were alienated. It's not to say that if you're an evangelical Christian, you're a flat earther, but a majority of the flat earthers were evangelical Christians because they thought that that was the way to reconcile the certain facts in the Bible with science.
Mhm.
But here I caught a break in talking to them because they were, considering themselves as scientists, interested in the question of evidence. And quite a number of their seminars were about the quote unquote evidence for flat Earth and, why NASA was lying, et cetera, right?
Mhm.
And so, I would ask them, I would say, once I opened my mouth, I would say, well, I understand that a lot of you are evangelical Christians, but your views here are not based on faith, are they? And they'd say, no, absolutely not. And say, well, they're based on evidence, right? Yes, absolutely based on evidence. And then I think at that point they were ready to have me start, quoting Galileo, but I didn't. What I did instead was quote Karl Popper. And I said, okay, so if your view is based on evidence and you think that you're reasoning scientifically, tell me what evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, would convince you that you were wrong.
Mhm.
And they couldn't answer that.
Right.
And think about the scientific attitude for a minute. They should have been able to answer that.
Sure.
And what I did there is I just paused and let them sit with the discomfort of not being able to answer that question. Some
Right.
people said, oh, just show me proof. And I'd say, well, you don't understand science. Science doesn't offer proof. I can't prove to you that aspirin is safe. I can't prove, that's just not how empirical reasoning works.
Vegetables, how do they work? I don't know.
It really, I mean, I didn't, get into the whole problem of induction, but it really is true, I think, even amongst people who trust science, that they don't understand how it works. I mean, it's not Euclidean geometry. It's based on the idea of warrant. You build up enough credibility for a theory and it lives to fight another day. But it still might be wrong. You still are inductivists are fallibilists, right? It still might be that, as I said in the book, future evidence could change your mind. That's the beauty of science. The uncertainty should be embraced. It's not something to be embarrassed by. So again, I let them sit with the discomfort of that. And some were more uncomfortable than others. But it was, we didn't talk about faith and we didn't talk about evidence. We talked about how they were reasoning on the basis of evidence. And they were really interested in talking to me. They didn't shun me. They didn't walk away. We tended to attract a crowd. People wanted to hear this kind of spontaneous debate.
Have you kept in touch with any of those people from the conference? It's after a couple of
No.
years.
I made a mistake. I should have, because looking back, you can't expect to convince anybody. Not that I did, but I mean, you can't convince somebody just with a one-off, just kind of a hit and run. Hi, I'm a stranger. You don't know me. Here are a few facts. Here's why you're illogical. Boom. It doesn't work like that. So I should have kept up with folks. Now, I've heard from a few of them, but I wouldn't say that we've kept up. I've heard some criticism, but
okay. Well, maybe they're out there listening to us right now, and maybe they'll buy the book and read it, and maybe they'll reestablish connection with you. Who knows?
Yeah,
we'll see how that goes. It also occurred to me that in the book that you didn't just talk to flat earthers. You also spoke to, I think I remember, was it coal miners in Western Pennsylvania? And I assume you spoke to them about climate change, was it?
I did, and that was part of my motivation for starting with the flat earthers, was that if I could learn how to talk to them about a subject that probably wasn't hurting anybody, then I could learn how to talk to climate deniers about something that was hurting us, something that I really cared about. And I faced, and I mean, I know that you know this, but I'll talk about it again because it's to me, it was an epiphany. The coal miners that I spoke with all believed in climate change. So if I had any vision of going into that room and, talking about their reasoning strategy or sharing any facts to convince them, I didn't need to do it. But I realized something very important, that it wasn't just about belief. It was about, in their cases, the folks that I spoke with, it was about love. It was about their love for their family. Who was going to take care of their family if they weren't coal miners? They lived in a part of the country where there weren't a lot of jobs to do other things. And one of the miners said something to me that was really interesting. He said, you've got to understand that miners are fatalistic. He said, we go down into that mine every single day knowing that we might die.
Yeah.
Given that, it's not as big of a deal to think about, well, is climate change hurting the planet? Might it be hurting me or my family down the road? We've got to put food on the table tonight.
Right.
And in that way, I began to realize that they were victims. They were not really the bad guys in this. They weren't the ones creating the disinformation. They weren't the ones profiting from the disinformation. I made another trip to talk with some Maldivian fishermen. They were also victims. They said something to me very interesting as well. They said, outside the Maldives, no one cares. And that was really a turning point for me in the research for the book.
No one cares about climate change?
About climate, about what's happening to the Maldives. And I realized that it's not just about belief, it's about caring. It's about wanting to do something about this, because what we're really trying to change around climate change, for instance, is not just belief, but behavior. And, our biggest barrier right now is about 20 members of Congress. Yeah. So, could you change their minds? Could you change their behavior? And in those cases, I don't even know, maybe they're cynically, maybe they do understand climate change, but they just, for whatever reason, won't change their view.
Yeah. So now might be a good time to introduce, I think these are the cognitive scientists you were referring to earlier, Philip Schmid and Cornelia Betch, I think are their names, who did some work on rebutting science denialism and public discussions. So could you talk a little bit more about their work and what you found useful and how you found that useful in your conversations with fishermen and coal miners and flat earthers, et cetera?
So they did a study that came out in Nature Human Behavior in December of 2019. And I joked with my friends that I could have read that study if my hair were on fire. Because, I had already been to Flat Earth. I had already been doing this. And this was the first empirical evidence to show that this kind of thing might be successful. So I'm not going to lie to you, maybe a little bit of confirmation bias for me, right? Oh boy, look, here's a study that vindicates what I was already doing. But the reason I found the study so fascinating is that they were doing, they said that there were two possible ways to push back against science deniers that they measured in the lab, and these were successful. Not always successful, but statistically significant. They sometimes work. One was content rebuttal, where if you're an expert, if you're a scientist of climatology, you can share facts, and they have a script in the paper that talks about how to do this. But then here's the part that I really loved in the study. What about the rest of us? What about the people who love science but we're not scientists? Is there any role for us? And there is, and it's called technique rebuttal.
Oh, okay.
And it takes this idea that was actually based on earlier work by cognitive scientists John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski, and even earlier work there from the Hufnagel brothers, that there are 5 tropes of science denial reasoning. There is cherry picking evidence, belief in conspiracy theories, illogical reasoning, reliance on fake experts, and the belief that science has to be perfect. Those 5 tropes are the blueprint for a flawed strategy. And that's the foundation for technique rebuttal. Betch and Schmid argued that you can use that if you're a layperson, if you're not a scientist, but you think about how science deniers are reasoning, you can, if you understand their script, you can use that to challenge them, which is sort of what I was doing right before it was identified as technique rebuttal, saying, well, why would you, be inconsistent enough to trust this person, but not that person,
Right.
Where is your evidence? Why, what evidence could show you that you were wrong? I was pushing on their technique of reasoning. And I just loved that study.
Yeah.
But it raised for me the question, of course, as a philosopher, I'm always wanting to push it. Would this work on hardcore deniers?
Mhm.
And would it work better face to face? Because their study was with university in Germany and the US, university students who presumably had not been marinating in scientific disinformation for 10 years. You know, they were
Right.
young people, maybe hearing it for the first time. And it was done online. And so I thought, okay, would this work? And that's when I really got interested in writing How to Talk to a Science Denier,
Mhm.
because we don't often face science deniers in the lab. We face them across the Thanksgiving table. They're our
Right.
cousins, they're our friends, our
Right.
coworkers. Those are the people that we have to reach. And if we can reach them face to face using technique rebuttal,
Mhm.
that means that we could create an army of people
Mhm.
who can go out there and push back. We don't have to let it go.
Mhm.
There's no backfire effect. We're not going to make it worse. We don't have to leave it up to the scientists, though they should play a role. The rest of us can get out there and do this. You don't have to go to a flat earth convention like I did, but you
Mhm.
can engage with science deniers
Mhm.
and maybe have some positive influence. And that to me was just a story that nobody else was telling in book form. And so I took the Bache and Schmidt study and some other really terrific work by Michael Shermer and Cook and Lewandowski and others, and put it all together and some anecdotal accounts, and then tried some of it myself practically, and that's what the book is.
Yeah, I'm curious. Have you, again, with the holidays sort of not too far off, Thanksgiving and Christmas, I'm imagining lots of,
Mhm.
dinner table conversations that could potentially
Yeah,
happen, especially around vaccines and COVID, et
yeah.
cetera. Have you had any? Have you witnessed any conversations like that in your personal life amongst friends or family members, and seen sort of this kind of model of pushing back on science denial? Have you actually seen it sort of up close and in person, and sort of could you offer tips to people about
Yeah,
how to deal with the cranky relative who
right.
thinks everything is a conspiracy?
John Cook actually has an app called A Cranky Uncle, where he gives you some script
Okay,
to do this, right? Terrific.
so it's like a
Um,
sparring partner that you can practice with.
yeah. So my knowledge on this comes for the most part from anecdotal accounts that I've read of times when this sort of thing has worked, and a
Mhm.
couple of them that I talk about in the book. One was the measles outbreak in Vancouver, Washington, a few
Mhm.
years back in the anti-vax community, where Governor Jay Inslee of Washington sent public health officials down to meet with the anti-vaxxers
Mhm.
one-on-one, and it worked. There's an account of this in the Washington Post that anybody can read. I think the story's called "It Will Take Off Like Wildfire." You can Google that. And there was this woman in the story who was an anti-vaxxer who said, this scientist took 2 hours with me, and he explained on a whiteboard cell interaction. He was so warm and so trustworthy, and I've decided to give my kids the vaccine. So I mean, so there are stories like that out
Mhm.
there, and it's easier to find them in the media than to witness them in the wild.
Mhm.
But since writing the book, I have gotten mail from folks who have been trying this, folks who are seeking my advice about how to try to do this. And again, I push them back to the anecdotal literature, because the fascinating thing to me about the anecdotal literature, I haven't really found studies on this, but the anecdotal literature makes clear that this does work.
Mhm.
Or let me put it this way: if if a hardcore denier is going to change their mind, this is how it happens. Um,
Mhm.
Another one of my favorite stories was Jim Bridenstine, the U.S. Member of Congress, who gave a speech against climate change in the floor of the U.S. House. And so, of course, Trump made him head of NASA, because what else would you do with a climate denier but make him head of NASA? Um, and within, I think it was a month, Bridenstine changed his mind about climate change and gave a speech saying, "I was wrong."
Oh, wow.
Now what happened?
Mhm.
I think what happened is that all of a sudden these scientists that he didn't trust before were his colleagues, were his
Mhm.
friends. He saw them every day over at NASA. He had lunch with them. He hung out with them in the halls. All of a sudden, the facts were making more sense because they came from a trustworthy source.
Mhm.
Um, there's a certain amount of confidentiality that I need to keep about my mail back and forth, because I have given people advice about how to handle things with family members. So I do have some personal anecdotes, but I'm not going to share them here.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And I'm looking at some of the questions that we've been getting from the attendees. And somebody asked, have you heard of ex-science deniers? It feels almost impossible to convince a science denier or conspiracy theorist. Even if you prove them wrong, admitting that they are wrong is too shameful a task. So they often double down, no? So that's kind of a little bit like what we were just talking about with the congressman who, you know, Trump put in charge of NASA. But then,
Yeah.
so there's one science denier.
Well,
there's others.
Yes, and I have a thick file of these,
okay.
I like to post them on Facebook. So if you go to my Facebook feed, I did one just the other day about a woman who not only did a 180, but said I was wrong. And here's why I was wrong. And the interesting part is that sometimes they're the ones who are the most fevered to get other people, you know, out of it. You know, it's kind of like what they do with cults, right? They find somebody who was in the cult to deprogram the people who are still in it. Maybe I shouldn't be making that analogy, but my point is that, you know, you do find that the folks who have all of a sudden decided, you know, I was wrong, I need to get the vaccine, they can get pretty fervent with their friends who are still anti-vaxxers about that. There are encouraging signs. There are Facebook groups that are devoted to actual evidence and calm conversation where people can get reliable information. You know, the thing about most science deniers that I always try to remember is that most of them are victims. They are not profiting from the disinformation that they're consuming. They're confused, they're fearful, I mean, that should push your empathy button. If you're getting impatient, as we all do, you know, take the vaccine already. Think of it that they're victims and they don't want to harm themselves. They don't want to harm family members. They don't want to do the wrong thing. And if you go into it insulting and angry, that is not going to convince them. But if you show some empathy, it just might work.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice reframe, not to approach these people as the enemy or engage or insult them or try to shame them, but see them as people who have been victimized basically by mass media and disinformation campaigns and God knows what AM talk radio. And
it goes deeper than that, though.
Yeah,
it does. They're the amplifiers of the disinformation, but it's a little bit more nefarious story where some of it's coming from.
Yeah. Well, that's a good jumping off point to talk a little bit about social media. You know, just this past month, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And you know, I was reading some articles about it recently, and I noticed that a number of commentators mentioned that you know, for as captured as that event was in the national consciousness, there was no social media at the time. There was no Facebook or Twitter, not even MySpace or Friendster. You know, that was all post 9/11. So it really just underscores how much of a 21st century phenomenon social media is. So do you think that there's a link between the rise of social media in the last 20 years and the rise of science denialism and disinformation campaigns? Do you see those two as very much intertwined?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Clear and simple answer.
Yeah. I mean, it has to be, because think of it this way. I saw a story the other day from NPR, which said that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people.
Wow.
I mean, that just shows you that would not have been possible in an era before social media. You could not, they could not get their message out there.
Just 12 random people could not.
They were not quite random. Some of them were quite famous, and they had different motivations, I believe, for the kind of disinformation that they were creating and spreading. Similar story about Facebook. It was 111 people, 111 accounts were responsible for 50% of the disinformation. We're not talking about large numbers here. Without social media, they would be voiceless.
Yeah, and there's actually you had a little experience yourself
Yeah.
online. You recently published a piece in the Baltimore Sun called "Why Are So Many Republicans Refusing Vaccination? Because Russia is telling them to." And that article claims that science denial is propaganda that's often created and spread by foreign governments with the
Yes,
intent to destabilize democracies, democratic societies. And you obviously received quite a bit of heat for that claim.
I did.
So what would you say to people who, to put it mildly, disagreed with you on that topic?
The evidence is out there. I did not make up that claim. I didn't break into CIA headquarters to, find evidence for it. That evidence is freely available. And why are we not talking about it every day? Why are people on major media talking about science denial as if it were an accident
Mhm.
rather than an intentional phenomena, right? Why are we there are nameable people and entities who are behind this, and we should be talking about that. So what
Mhm.
I argued in that piece was available from the Wall Street Journal. There was kind of a blip in March or April of this year where the US State Department made a finding, announced that Russian, foreign intelligence service in Russia was behind 4 different nameable media outlets that were, pumping out propaganda that the Russian government was, profiting by. Now, not profiting by necessarily economically, but
Mhm.
they're seeking to destabilize us. And there was a outstanding story in the New York Times a few years back called "Putin's Long War Against American Science," demonstrating that they have an interest in undermining U.S. confidence in our institutions, like
Mhm.
science, and now in the COVID vaccine. And so a lot of the propaganda, a lot of the anti-science propaganda about COVID, about climate change, about GMOs is coming from Russia. And it's not that they necessarily want to convince us of any particular, one thing, other than that you can't trust American institutions to tell you the truth. They
Mhm.
want chaos.
Right, of
And
course.
of course, the pushback I got against this was Russia, Russia, Russia. It's always Russia. Well, sometimes it is always Russia. There are the talking point right now
Right.
in the Republican Party is, that it was such a farce to think that they had anything to do with the 2016 election, how that was all a witch hunt, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that was the result of the Mueller report. But even if somebody believed that, it doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as Russian propaganda, on science. It's the facts are out there. The evidence is out there. People should look into it. And here I blame the media a little bit because they haven't been talking about it enough. I'll tell you who does take this seriously: the United States military.
Mhm.
They just released a new training manual, which is a graphic novel. It's not My Father's Army anymore, but it's a graphic novel called Invisible Force, out of
Mhm.
the US Army Cyber Institute, to talk about how to fight an information war. And I just did a piece with Jonathan Rauch in the Washington Post called "A War on Truth is Raging," trying to wake people up to this idea that we are in an information war. This is not an accident; it's on purpose. Um,
Mhm.
that piece emphasized the idea that Trump was a little bit more of the ringmaster for this in the United States.
Mhm.
Uh, but since then, and a collateral to that, I've been doing some research on the idea that foreign intelligence services are not only pumping out propaganda, but they provided the blueprint that Trump followed. There's
Mhm.
something called the fire hose of falsehood. You just tell so many lies that people finally say, well, maybe we can't know the truth. Exactly. That's exactly where the
That's the
propaganda
whole point.
wants you
Yeah.
wants you to be. So,
Right.
information war is ugly, but you have to realize that you're in one. And I think we're in an information war about the COVID vaccine right now, and we don't even think that we're in one. The disinformation that gets amplified by celebrities and sports stars, the different influencers. Some of it has its roots in Russian troll farms, and they don't even realize it.
Yeah. I'm going to go and switch over to some of the questions that we've received from the audience as
Okay.
you and I have been chatting so enjoyably here. First question up that I see is, what can science and scientists do to engender the trust that science deniers seem to need?
Oh, what a great question. Um, it
There's a
seems
doctoral dissertation in there somewhere.
I wonder how many people actually know a scientist.
Mhm,
The people
Yeah.
who are science deniers, have they ever met a scientist?
mhm,
Because scientists are warm people. They're trustworthy people. They're passionate about their work. And I think that, look what happens when people meet one. When Jim Bridenstine met, a bunch. When the woman in Vancouver, Washington, had that 2-hour encounter with the guy teaching her cell interaction. People realize, yes, these are people that you can trust. So I think the thing for scientists to do is to get out there, to meet more people. They don't have to go to a flat earth convention, though I would welcome the help, right? And I've now since then gotten a few to commit to come to the next one and help me. But
mhm,
it seems to me that, I went to the March for Science, and everybody in Boston showed up.
mhm.
But do scientists have business cards? Can they hand it out at their PTA meeting? Can they get,
And a T-shirt that says, "I'm a scientist. Ask me anything."
yes, exactly. Really, I think that if more people met scientists, they would
Yeah.
trust scientists.
Yeah, that's probably a big part of it. Now they got to get out of the lab and into
They do.
get them to join bowling leagues or something. I don't know. So on that question, sort of a follow up, have you found that changing terminology from terms like "I believe such and such" to "I understand such and such" affects the conversation in a positive way? So the idea of
Hmm.
switching between belief and understanding, does
I,
that soften it at all?
I guess to make it so that would make it clear, because belief can be either faith or opinion or
Yeah.
evidence. To put the only thing I'd be careful of there with saying "I understand" is that scientists do occasionally change their minds. And when they
Mhm.
do, that's an opportunity for a denier to begin distrust, right?
Yeah.
Look what happened with mask wearing, right?
Mhm.
And so the times that I think that scientists are the most persuasive is when they don't run away from uncertainty, but they embrace it.
Mhm.
When they say, look, we don't know everything, but here's what we think we do know based on the evidence. And here's what we found. So
Mhm.
here's why we believe this. Now, if we found this
Right.
other thing, we would change our mind. But we haven't found that yet, but we're looking. I think
Mhm.
that's a very persuasive way to make the
Right.
argument. And in fact, there was a focus group that Frank Luntz, the famous Republican
I know.
pollster, did with people who were vaccine hesitant, in which a scientist took exactly that approach. And that was the most persuasive thing that he found in that group. By the end of it, all 19 people in the focus group said that they were more likely to get the vaccine. And it was largely due to that one scientist who was humble, who was kind, who made it clear that, he knew his stuff, but he didn't make it sound like science knew everything.
Right.
I think that's important.
Yeah. No doubt. Another question from the audience is it possible to convince a science denier whose denial is based on religious beliefs if accepting scientific
Mm.
facts or truths leads them to reject their religious beliefs or interpretations of religious beliefs, then that would be a big ask of such a person? Is that something you've run into a lot, where scientific thinking or reasoning conflicted with religious beliefs?
In some individual cases, it does, but I have to say that those are people who are looking for a fight. Those are people who have decided that their religious
Mhm.
beliefs conflict with the scientific beliefs, because there are an awful lot of scientists who have not decided that. All right. So, for every flat earther who says, well, I have to believe in flat earth because it's the only way to make sense of the Noah's flood in the Bible,
Mhm.
there are 100 other Christians who say, really? No, I believe in the Bible, but I don't believe in the flat earth. So if somebody's looking for that kind of conflict, I think they can find it. But I think that most folks who are religious, with, exceptions, have come around to the Galilean principle that, Galileo always said that he was trying to not only protect science from religion, but religion from science. That these were separate ways of
separation of church and state.
That's right. And I the Catholic Church right now is embracing. They just had a seminar on a conference on post-truth. I mean, they're interested in what scientists have to say. They're interested in scientific evidence. They're interested in making that sort of a reconciliation between faith and science. Francis Collins is one of the most famous biologists. I mean, everybody has heard of him for his work on the Human Genome Project. Yes. And he's a Christian. So, I mean, could someone decide that there was this massive conflict and they couldn't reason their way out of it? Yes, they could. And it might be almost impossible to convince them otherwise. But I think that one thing that you could do here maybe is give them, depending, on what their views were, give them a copy of Francis Collins's book, or, help them to understand that these are there's not necessarily a conflict here, right? There might be. I mean, some atheists pick fights as well. They might say, oh yes, there's a conflict here. I'm a big tent guy. I think that there is room for a lot of people who are on the side of science, and I don't want to, say that we're excluding anybody based on their beliefs about values or normative values or other things.
Yeah. Well, here's another great question to toss your way. Science denial seems to be more common among conservatives. Are there any examples of science denial that are more common among left-wing groups?
Well, I have a chapter on this in my book. I have a chapter on this in my book. And before COVID, anti-vax was about equally liberal and conservative. Now, for different reasons, liberals tended to distrust vaccines because they didn't like big pharma, and the conservatives because they didn't like government mandates. The one that I discuss in the book is actually GMOs, genetically modified organisms, where it seemed to me that was well represented on the left. Now, would you call that an example of left-wing science denial? It depends on what you mean by that. Is it predominantly left-wing? No, there's left and right. Is there a great representation of liberals amongst people who think that GMOs are going to kill them, even though there's no scientific evidence to support that? Yeah, there are a lot. So, I think that there are examples of what you could credibly call left-wing science denial. It's untrue to say that it's mostly a right-wing phenomena. There are areas like COVID and climate change that can be politicized, but there are some that are not politicized, or let me put it this way, haven't been politicized yet. Now, I have to say, Stephen Lewandowski, the cognitive scientist I mentioned earlier, whose work I massively respect, he has got an argument that it all stems from the right. But this is a paper that I discuss in my book, and I don't think that he's right about that. But if you want to read the controversy, it's in the book.
Okay. Here's an easy question for you. What was your favorite part of writing and researching the book, and why?
My favorite part, I was so fascinated with this topic that my favorite part is that I was able to work. This is going to sound corny, but I was able to work on it all day, every day. I mean, of course, part of that was because there was a pandemic, right? And so that was not a good situation.
We should clarify here for the audience that you actually signed the contract, I think, before the pandemic started, or right about the time the pandemic started. So
I did. And Phil, if you remember, the original proposal for the book didn't mention COVID. It didn't have anything about COVID in it. But when I signed the contract, I said, okay, I'm going to save the last chapter for COVID denial, which didn't exist at that time. And I remember us having a conversation about it. And I said, yeah, it will. And then it's hard because when you say favorite, that puts a positive valence on it. But I got to see in real time uh, a pathogen be born, right? Not just COVID, but the infodemic surrounding it, right? What it looked like to watch a science denial campaign start up from scratch. So that was fascinating to me. So I can't say it was my favorite in the sense that I wish COVID had never happened. I wish that the infodemic had never happened. But as a researcher on this for so long, it was really amazing to me to watch this happen and to be able to just drill down and have it be covered in the news, to have everybody talking about what it meant to believe in science. And I felt useful. I felt like I was making hoping that I was making a difference for science. And also, if you remember the conversations you and I had, hoping that this work would come out in time, that it would, still be relevant. And again, not something we'd hoped for.
We foolishly believed there was a window that was going to shut.
Yeah, not something we hoped for, but here it does actually end up still, to be relevant, unfortunately.
Let's see, there was another interesting question. One of my colleagues at the press asked, said, regarding vaccine hesitancy, are there perhaps legitimate reasons for the public to distrust the pharmaceutical industry? Might efforts to combat science denialism and anti-vax ideology be more effective if they were combined with good faith critiques of the economics of big pharma, rather than dismissing distrust of scientific authorities out of hand? That's a complicated question.
Well, no, I think that's important in the same way that we shouldn't just have blind faith in whatever a scientist says. It's a legitimate thing to say, do they have any conflicts of interest? Where is their funding? What other things have they published? Now, that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as credibility, or that once your doubts are answered, you shouldn't give your trust. I mean, trust does have to be earned, but I think it's legitimate to raise those sorts of questions. But here again, I'm going to draw the difference between doubt and distrust. Doubt can be overcome by evidence. Distrust cannot.
Yeah.
So if you distrust the pharmaceutical industry, and no amount of evidence will ever make you change your mind, I think you're on the road to denial.
Yeah.
Because then ask yourself, you distrust the pharmaceutical industry on the COVID vaccine, yet you probably take some other medications made by Pfizer.
Sure.
You probably trust them for other things.
Yeah.
So, where does that distrust come from? Why on this subject in particular? So as you're questioning the scientists and the pharmacy folks, question yourself too. Ask yourself, why do I care so much about this particular issue? Is this something that I have a prior commitment to? Is this something that, is one of my hot button issues? That's something always to keep in mind. Again, we've all got cognitive bias, not just the deniers. We're all capable of this.
Sure. Well, Lee, I could talk to you for probably another hour about all these topics. It's so rich and it's so relevant and it's so important to what's going on in the world today. But I just got a note where we're going to have to start wrapping up at this point. So I'll just let you, if you want to say one more thing about, I guess, just buy the book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, available on Amazon and MIT Press, and find booksellers everywhere, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll say this, if folks want to learn more about me and my work, go to leemcintyrebooks.com, where you can link to my past events, see my upcoming speaking events, look at some of my other books, which most of them, but not all of them, are published with MIT Press. But I've got some other books there as well. The important ones. And of all the other recent ones. And so thank you for having me to do this. It.
Well, good luck with the book and the rest of your publicity events that you have going here. I know you've got a few things in the pipeline that I won't mention here, but looking forward to seeing this book, momentum for the book increase. And I'm sure we'll get together and talk about topics like this again in the future, perhaps even on MIT Press Live again.
I hope so. And thank you. I want to just give a quick shout out to all the folks at MIT Press who have helped me over the years. It's a pleasure to work with everyone. And I wanted you to know that.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Well, we appreciate working with a pro like you. It's great. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll sign off here and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.